Hello, and welcome to the Employee Safety Podcast from Alert Media, where you'll hear advice from industry leaders on how to protect your people and business. I'm Peter Steinfeld. The 2026 FIFA World Cup is set to be the largest and most complex in the event's history, spanning 3 countries, 16 host cities, and more than a month of operational pressure. Today, I'm joined again by my friend and colleague, Sarah Prattley, Senior Vice President of Global Intelligence at Alert Media, to talk through how organizations can prepare for the cascading impacts surrounding the World Cup. Here's our conversation. Hey, Sarah, thanks for being here.
Hi, Peter. Thanks so much for having me on again. I'm really looking forward to digging into this topic.
Yeah, this is going to be good stuff. Let's start with your team. You have been doing a lot of work to prepare for this tournament. Can you tell us a little bit about the Global Intelligence team and how you're approaching something as large as the World Cup?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a ton when we think about the threat landscape, everything that we're looking for, everything that we're monitoring, even several weeks out. We've got an amazing global intelligence team. They've been reporting on and analyzing and planning and supporting our customers already across so many different areas with this, everything from strategic intelligence as we do these deeper dives and look aheads to really narrowly focusing on kinetic events that could impact anybody who's around the venues and the sites, travel security. And then I can imagine our meteorologists, they will be really busy throughout the event as well. So again, just kind of a culmination of a lot of things coming together with the team, especially as we think about just the duration and the size of this event, 3 countries, more than a dozen different host cities. We've got numerous different base camps that are hosting teams. So there's really just a ton at play that the team is continuing to work towards for our customers.
Well, they have a lot to cover, so let's dive into some specific risk categories that your team has identified as potentially disruptive for organizations. From a physical security standpoint, where are the biggest exposures surrounding the 2026 World Cup?
Yeah, as you mentioned, and if you just kind of think in your brain, right, there's so many different locations. I think many people will reasonably start to think kind of primarily around the main sites, particularly the stadiums that are hosting the matches. Those absolutely will be incredibly important focal points when we think about this, particularly stadium gates, immediate surrounding areas there. That said, it's really the locations beyond that I think could have the biggest exposure. We're thinking about all of these fan zones from, bars to watch parties. There's the transit corridors, all of these different hubs and sites that'll really be around and supporting. And that's where we're going to see, equally as large crowds. We're going to see, in some cases, less security, potential gaps there. And I think that's why it's super important for folks operating in and around these areas to really be paying particular attention to those. And we also think about physical threats. There's a lot of things that we'll be watching for and anticipating, everything from opportunistic crimes, right? You got a lot of crowds, you're going to have a lot of petty theft, the opportunities for property crime. Violent crime could be seen in specific cities. I know there's a lot of focus in particular towards Mexico right now. So we're watching a lot of activity and a lot of preparation there. Hooliganism, of course, fans. We do get quite rowdy fans around these sorts of matches and activity. So that's something that's, a particular point of interest as well, depending on different facilities and different teams. And then also indirect impacts that go here as well. The strain that we'll be seeing on things like emergency services in these areas. I know that cities and locations are taking really great care to staff up, but we will see a lot of pressure on those areas on emergency services that will be stretched thin with all of these heavy crowds.
I know that civil unrest is another category that your team is tracking closely. What's driving protest risk during the tournament?
Yeah, absolutely. So we mentioned protests and demonstrations quite a bit on my team. We've seen the numbers of demonstrations and protests really rise significantly in recent years, really in every corner of the globe. We've also seen trends like these mega demonstration campaigns where we're getting a few groups that are calling for events across a multitude of cities, sometimes hundreds of cities. So that's definitely an area that we're focusing ahead of and during all of the events and the matches. And when it comes to the World Cup, we definitely expect to see demonstration activity around all of the events. Some of it will be directed towards FIFA, everything from any political engagements. Also, we've seen different things recently with people and fans getting upset about the video review policies. So some of it will be directed towards FIFA. We've got billions of eyeballs, but we'll have probably a much more distinct number of events that are really topically focused outside of FIFA and outside of these matches. Everything from geopolitical events like the conflict in the Middle East, groups drawing attention to what they're experiencing, maybe even across the United States or across different other areas, especially as we think about the weave in of politics. I know in the United States earlier this year, we, of course, had a lot of activity around ICE and immigration policies. We actually saw this play out already in a few different soccer matches, one with LAFC fans and again with Minneapolis fans, just bringing different posters, different visible things into stadiums during events. Another important point to note here, too, we've got the US Mexico Canada trade agreement that ironically is going to be discussed actually during the midst of the tournament. So that could create another political flashpoint as well. And as we see very often, most demonstrations actually end up being peaceful. That's something that we pay quite close attention to on my team. What I would say, though, is even all of these peaceful demonstrations can be incredibly disruptive, right? Especially as we think about the number of people that are going to be around venues and locations. It's going to be already congested. And as we think about different protests and demonstrations, we could get that even further congestion, a lot of blocking of potential transit routes and things of that nature, too.
Now, when leaders hear global event, terrorism concern is often part of the security conversation. So, what's the current outlook around this tournament?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I definitely think, as we start off the top here, I think it's important to note that at this point, we are not tracking any credible and specific plots that are targeting the World Cup or any of the events or matches. But the World Cup, its scale, its visibility, it certainly raises concerns very much so in this environment, especially when we consider things like lone actors. That is a primary concern around the matches and events. These sorts of actors and events can be really hard to detect ahead of time. And they use things like low tech tactics like vehicle rammings, mass stabbings. And both of those things are really difficult to disrupt before they happen. The stadiums hosting the matches are certainly these focal points, but it's those surrounding areas that could be even more prominent soft targets with that heavier foot traffic and those lighter screenings. And then we really can't emphasize that point enough. The areas of interest for these events are very vast, right? They span hotels, training grounds, fan areas. When we think about the radius around these events, it's quite expansive. It's well beyond even some of the things that I've mentioned as we think about even the perimeter by which people will be staying and traveling in. And then I suppose there's another important point to make here as well, especially as we saw the situation that unfolded in Mexico earlier this year after the killing of one of the notorious cartel leaders there, the violence that ensued in the days after. It did dissipate and a normalized state came about fairly quickly there, but it does raise different concerns in this area. I know that members of FIFA were actually in Mexico several weeks ago, actually talking to authorities about the security plan and revisiting kind of World Cup security for this exact reason.
You bring up a really good point that you've got these main venues where people will be. That's where the highest level of risk probably will be, but there will also be the higher level of security. And then you start moving to these other places a little bit further away. And because the risk drops a little bit, so does the security as well. So is that something that your team thinks about? Like, hey, less security here, easier target, maybe something we need to keep more of an eye on?
Very much, especially as we see a potential event unfolding in these areas real time around the events and the matches. We'll see a lot of priority on those stadiums and what's happening there, but it's really that vicinity outside we'll be paying even more close attention to for that exact reason.
What about cyber? It seems like cyber risk tends to spike around major global events. So what patterns are you expecting with it here?
Yeah, cyber risks are an absolute guarantee here. And we can learn a lot from what we've seen in the past. If you look back to the last World Cup, we saw things like widespread scams that were tied to things like ticketing and fan services, everything from fake websites, apps, phishing campaigns, all aimed at the normal things cyber criminals aim their targets at, harvesting credentials, payment details. And I think what's really complicating things and matters here even more is just the introduction of AI into the scene and the landscape. As we all know, AI enhances not only the speed by which things can be created, but also the quality. And when it comes to these attacks and these scams, really to think about the quality and the quantity of these, I think is really important here as well. And then I know many are probably thinking this is more of a vulnerability for fans and those who are seeking out tickets. And it absolutely is, don't get me wrong. But we all need to remember that our businesses are at risk too. Of course, if employees are clicking sketchy links, but also fake scams that are really convincing with logos, with brands. Our businesses don't necessarily need to be involved in the games, but they can unexpectedly get thrust into the middle of things for that exact reason. So the World Cup is really the ideal focus for these cyber actives. You've got a huge demand, and that's going to drive urgency, and that drives situations where people let their guards down.
Yeah, I know we were talking a couple days ago about this idea of people are trying to get tickets like last minute and they'll see a ticket pop up. It seems like a great price. They click on the link right away because they're trying to get the ticket. And it's like, oh, whoops, I just let a bad guy into my phone, potentially into my work network, whatever it is. So, probably a really good time for organizations to just do an education campaign across their employee base, just warning them that this kind of stuff can happen.
Totally. Socialization, education. And for most of us, it's just a strong reminder. I want to get tickets to the matches too. So I'm eager and I'm excited. And again, that's the point by which our guard is slightly down, right? There's that urgency and that excitement that's driving us.
So, during high visibility events, perception can become a real threat vector. What does disinformation risk look like during a tournament like this?
Yeah, it's another really important one to mention, especially we just noted the entry of AI into the game and the scene here. We can certainly see that generation of brand logos or even leadership likeness, right? That type of stuff that I'm also concerned about that could lead to everything from like false safety alerts to maybe fake cancellations, things that could be spread really fast and cause confusion. Confusion for fans, but more so for us, what we're thinking about is confusion for businesses and confusion for employees. And this is where I think it's particularly important for all of us to have our trusted sources of information. And for employees, that should, of course, be the pertinent business leaders like security, maybe corporate comms, business continuity teams, so that there's an expectation set really early for where information is going to come from, even kind of what cadence they should expect things on, what communications channels, so that that keeps things buttoned up even more. And then we think about the potential and risk to business and to brands. I also think about the monitoring aspect, right? Having information as soon as possible is incredibly important when we think about these things. And what we continue to see is false information shared across social media platforms and that information spreading really quickly. So those are the places that organizations need to be monitoring their brands for all of these reasons. Everything from the traditional social media platforms to some of the more fringe social media platforms, the things like Gab and Getter and 4chan, the list goes on, right? I think being prepared here and having a plan to monitor these spaces is something businesses should be thinking about now ahead of the World Cup. And even aside from it simply as a best practice, but really being very involved in their security and their threat landscape awareness. And then I think, too, just another thing I'll note here, another related element is really the matches and even the players. We're continuing to see disinformation and we will see disinformation uptick. We recently saw a very quick spread about one of the Iranian players who had allegedly decided to join the Iranian army. His agent came out very quickly to refute this and to warn about the disinformation. But due to, of course, the heightened landscape around the Middle East, due to the heightened attention to the World Cup, it spread very quickly. So this is another area I'd expect to see more activity and that my team will be paying very close attention ahead of the matches and even during the matches.
Yeah, it's getting really difficult because maybe the misinformation, the disinformation comes out, and then the person that was being accused of it corrects the record. But then you're starting to think, do I trust that? And it just kind of spirals out of control. How do you stay on top of all that?
Yeah, and this is where it's really trusted sources of information. I can't say that enough. It's trust and it's also validation, right? If we and our teams are seeing information, really looking at the credibility, really looking towards verification so that we understand the truth and can then help that to drive our decision making with our employees.
When you train your team, is there like a initial gut reaction you tell them to have? Or do you say, ignore that gut reaction? Here's the process you should go through when you receive new information, no matter how believable it is. How do you like slow down and then go through a process to then validate something?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both or everything that you mentioned. Part of it is their familiarity with situations. Part of it is some expertise that our team has just from their analysis, their background in intelligence. Another part of it is the source of information. We do a lot of work on our end to really create networks of credible sources, tens of thousands of verified sources really in our catalogs. So having that awareness, that credibility, and that skepticism, I think is really important too when it's not coming from that credible source. So there's a lot that goes into it.
And do you recommend if you, let's say it's just someone out there running a business, they got 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, whatever it is that they're looking out for, and they get some information, they're not sure if it's real or not. They've tried to do some analysis on it. It looks to be pretty bad. Is that something they should immediately start to share with other people or maybe the executives, or do they wait till they find out more about what's going on? What's a good cadence to share that information? When should you do it? And what kind of caveats should you put along with it?
Yeah, I think the caveats is the important part. For me, sharing and creating awareness, at least at certain levels, very quickly is important because, as we mentioned earlier, things can spread like wildfire. So you want to get ahead of it, even if it is just internally with some internal stakeholders, but being transparent. Here's what we have. Here are the questions that we're asking. And just being honest, this is why I'm bringing this to you, because if this evolves, here's the impacts that we foresee. And then continuously having those transparent conversations and updates so that you're kind of already ahead of the curve if there is an action that needs to be taken.
Well, switching gears a little bit, this is, as you mentioned before, an event that's going to happen over a big geographical distance. So travel friction may be one of the most operationally disruptive elements of this whole thing. Where should organizations focus?
Yeah, I mean, it's huge, right? Dozens of cities across the course of 5 weeks. This has the most potential to cause impacts for businesses, even if folks aren't actually traveling to these events. We're going to have folks traveling all around them, whether it's for business purposes or whether it's just for, summer vacation here in North America. And the things my team and I are really thinking about fall into a few different areas. It's everything from visa appointments and backups there that can be really crushing and can crunch even closer to all of these matches. Increased border traffic. Part of this experience is happening across 3 different countries. So that border traffic is really a part of the experience itself, but we will expect to see challenges with border and with border control and border crossings just simply because of the volume, let alone any security implications that happen. Also, lodging shortages. When you think about the number of people that are condensing to these areas, we've got thousands, if not tens of thousands of fans in different locations. And that's really going to push different areas that may not have as much lodging. And then I realize many people listening probably will be well aware of the scale and the timing of all of these events. But I think equally important is that many people in their organization might not necessarily be thinking about this right now. There's a lot of us who are, maybe a lot of us listening in are, but socializing around an organization. We may have employees who are saying, like, oh, yeah, I know there's this major soccer thing coming up in the United States, and there's a lot of fanfare around it, but might not truly understand the number of locations, how they could be impacted. If they're trying to create business travel plans around certain locations, they might not necessarily be thinking about some of the disruptions that this could cause for them. And then, of course, directly to the business.
Yeah, it might be a good idea to reach out to your prospects, your customers, and say, hey, maybe we should think about moving our meeting to a week or two after or before the event occurs because it'll save everyone time, money, etc.
Yeah, a very easy thing to do now ahead of time is to look at the locations, look at the timing. We've got information and time on our side.
What about climate and environmental factors? They seem to be part of the threat landscape these days that people are really concerned about. What stands out here for the World Cup?
Yeah, happy you asked that. We have an awesome team of meteorologists. They've been flagging a lot of things that we will be watching as we get closer. And of course, during all of the events, everything from severe weather to natural disasters that could impact any one, if not several, of the events that are happening over the course of these 5 weeks. We're already seeing wildfires happening across the United States. Canada's, of course, coming off its second worst wildfire season ever, and we're in severe drought in many locations. So many more locations around these games are really susceptible to this wildfire activity. The tournament's also happening during the hurricane season, right? Well, we will be several weeks into the hurricane season at that point, and we're going to be watching not only the Atlantic hurricane season, but also storms that are happening out in the Pacific because we've got Mexico, we've got the West Coast in play, and then all kinds of other extreme weather events, everything from extreme heat, severe thunderstorms, massive flooding. These are things that we experience across this entire geography during these months of the year. So I can't imagine that we're going to get out of this tournament without some sort of impacts. So that does lean into a really good point that people are going to want to be looking at the forecasting, watching the trends, and also seeing how this could impact people, but also people movement around these locations during these times.
Yeah, which ties back into the travel, which we spoke about before. And it seems like weather and environment can be so cascading in their impact Not only does it impact the flights, but the ability to drive places, the games themselves might be delayed. It just can create a real cascade of effects.
Right. All of those things.
Yeah. Are there any other additional disruptors that your team is watching that leaders might overlook?
Yeah, the list, honestly, Peter, goes on and on. I'll highlight a few of them. Drone activity is one in particular the team will be watching. We're seeing a bigger impact here as we think about drones and how they can impact live events, sporting events in particular. We've seen plenty of examples. It's the unexpected drones themselves, of course, that can delay things or cause concern, but also counter drone measures. Not that those are bad things, they're great things, but those, of course, will add delays as well. Certainly, infrastructure strain, everything from power grids to transportation. When we're looking at all of these cities that are hosting in one capacity or another, some have really great transportation infrastructure, but many do not. So we're looking at a lot of congestion and a lot of strain on the transportation that does exist in these cities. And of course, people taking alternatives, rideshare apps that are going to be congested, taxis and other services, rental car services. And then I'd also note just the fact that minor incidences in all of these situations can really cascade into larger impacts. I think that's another one that's important to note too, and something that we're always looking at, right? A small event or something that would generally have a small impact if nothing was going on can have a very, very devastating impact when we've got high density, high emotion in all of these atmospheres.
That's a really good point. How should leaders think about how risk intensifies just in general over the 5-week window?
Yeah, it's a prolonged event. And as we look at this and the week to week of all of it, all the things that we've talked about will absolutely intensify in each phase. As we get down to fewer teams, fewer matches, we'll see even larger crowds because we're going to have fewer locations. We're going to have this mass audience and attention to fewer of these events. We're also going to see more travel. We'll see stronger demand for tickets, stronger demand for hotels. And all of this is going to intensify with each passing week as we get closer to those finals. So I think simply recognizing that now and being in that planning phase and understanding kind of these changing phases is really important for all leaders as we're looking at the World Cup. Again, we've got the benefit of time on our side. Some of this is pretty predictable when we think about crowds and crowd movements and how things are going to continue to evolve throughout the tournament. So those are things that people should be looking at now.
Yeah, not only does it seem to intensify, but it also gets a lot more last minute and random because as different teams win, it's going to change behavior. People had no intention of going to, let's say, Mexico City, might end up going to Mexico City last minute. And that it just gets kind of crazy there toward the end.
Exactly. It's exciting, right? But it will also be equally chaotic and crazy too.
Yeah, indeed. Well, if an organization wants to start preparations or just advance their current plans, what are the most practical steps they should take now?
I think first off, you're listening into this. So clearly you have interest, which is great. Taking interest is a huge part in preparedness. I'd start looking primarily at the locations. I think that's such a good starting point, both host cities and those base camps. And then I would just cross reference that with my assets. Where do I have employees? Where do I have offices? Where do I potentially have travelers? And then, as we think about this too, I would also add in a few other locations that are specific to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I think that is very important for us to recognize here too. That's going to be happening in the midst of the game. So those locations will be important too. So as you map kind of your locations, as you map your assets, that's going to give you a really good idea at this point of where you're going to have some of the biggest challenges, where you might have to start thinking about your business continuity, thinking about security, developing geo-specific contingencies. You can also think at this point about number one, communicating around what the business is doing, but also pre-building your communications so that you've got some templates built out. And also, this is a great way to establish that source of truth that I mentioned earlier. And then just getting yourself set up to monitor real time as we think again about the number of locations, the number of demonstrations that could happen, the number of kinetic events. This is really the time for people to be taking into consideration how they're going to monitor for all of these things that are going to be popping up around their locations. And I think one other thing I would suggest to folks, I mentioned earlier all the preparedness that my team is doing, a lot of the reporting and analysis. Another really helpful thing that people could do is download our World Cup situation report. You can go to alertmedia.com. It's free and available there. And I think it not only touches upon some of the things we mentioned today, but I think it'll help enlighten on other topics that some businesses really want to start having those preparedness conversations around ahead of the tournament.
Well, Sarah, once again, thank you so much for being on the show and for all the great work that your team and you do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fun topic. It will be an amazing tournament, I'm sure, but happy for all of us to be preparing so far in advance for all of the uncertainty to come so that we can plan and prepare best.
Indeed. To learn more about how Alert Media's global intelligence team can help your organization prepare for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, download the full situation report Sarah mentioned in the episode description. You can also watch video highlights on Alert Media's YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Stay safe out there.
Thank you for listening to the Employee Safety Podcast from Alert Media, the world's leading provider of risk intelligence and response solutions. To learn more about how to protect your people in business during critical incidents, visit alertmedia.com.